the Soviet collapse was not due to any crisis in the socialist system. There was no manifest crisis in the socialist system in the Soviet Union in 1985. There was no mass unemployment. There were no strikes. There were no riots. There was no clamoring for a change in leadership. There was no crisis.
After 1988, when Ligachev was removed from the Politburo, Gorbachev and Yakovlev pretty much had a free hand to move rightward.
We have genocide in Gaza. We have war in Iran. We have war in the Ukraine. We have Cuba on the verge of a collapse. None of these would be possible if the Soviet Union, none of these occurred when the Soviet Union existed. None of them would be possible today if the Soviet Union existed.
Welcome to History Experience.
Hey guys, for our show today we have not one but two guests, Professor Roger Keeran and Labour economist Joe Jamison. We'll be discussing their book, Socialism Betrayed, Behind the Collapse of the Soviet Union, which offers a multifaceted look at the collapse of the Soviet state. So thank you very much, Roger and Joe, for agreeing to join us.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Could you share an overview of your book, including what motivated you to write it and the central theme or message it conveys?
Well, let me give a stab at this, and then we'll go back and forth. We basically have very similar ideas, Joe and I, but we have, slight differences, and human beings do. But both Joe and I are connected with a website called Marxist-Leninism Today, mltoday.com. So if any of your viewers and listeners like what they hear coming from us, they can get more of this perspective on mltoday.com. But we're both socialists and both supporters of the Soviet Union, and we were chagrined by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I think even more chagrined by the lack of serious analysis of what happened in the Soviet Union that led to this collapse. And so even though neither of us are specialists on Russia or the Soviet Union, we, at Joe's suggestion, we decided to take on this task and put a couple of years aside to really dig into this question and see what we could determine. Because in the wake of the Soviet collapse, all kinds of explanations were put forth. You might remember that right afterwards, I think a year or so afterwards, Fukuyama published a book called The End of History. And his argument was that the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that there was no more class conflict, no more socialism in the future, that the future was capitalism. Well, that didn't strike us as very likely that class conflicts, inequalities, exploitation still existed worldwide. People were still going to struggle. But there were all other kinds of explanations about the Soviet collapse, that socialism didn't work, that this was the result of Stalinism, etc. So it was the weakness, or seemingly weakness, of these other explanations that prompted us to make our own investigation. Anything you want to add, Joe?
As Roger said, we were both sympathizers with it. I visited it as an economics student, a graduate student, way back in 1972. Roger visited the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And the achievements of the Soviet Union were, to my mind, just enormous. Social equality, universal free healthcare, cheap housing, free education was available to all, full employment, the ending of inflation, the ending of racial and national discrimination, largely, not totally. And by the mid-1970s, workers in the Soviet Union had a month's vacation. That doesn't even exist in the United States today. If you start a new job, you get 2 weeks vacation in the good old US of A. So there were very high standards of culture. Soviet people read more books and saw more films than anywhere else in the world. The Soviet Union abolished illiteracy, even in Soviet Central Asia, where almost universal illiteracy had existed before 1917. So the downfall was so unexpected because the Soviet Union had survived far greater tests. For example, the Nazi invasion of 1941-45, which left some 27 million dead. And all the invasions a generation earlier by 14 Western countries in 1918, 1921. So as Roger said, we expected that many books on the collapse would soon appear after 1991, but that didn't happen. So we resolved to take it on and write our own. And that's really the origin story of the book.
Preposterous to us to say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a sign of the failure of socialism, when the socialist regime and the Soviet Union accomplished all of these things, even though it never was greater than 30% of the U.S. economy. I mean, it was a smaller economy, but even with a smaller economy, it provided more for its people than the U.S. does, for example. I think the other thing is that it was I was going to say a beacon for the rest of the world, but gave material support to the rest of the world that were struggling against colonialism, against imperialism, or trying to build socialism. And this was consistent throughout the history of the Soviet Union. Supporting the Vietnamese, supporting the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, supporting Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, the world we live in today, which has really unleashed imperialism since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the Soviet Union is not there as a counterforce to this imperialism. So what do we have? We have genocide in Gaza. We have war in Iran. We have war in the Ukraine. We have Cuba on the verge of a collapse. None of these would be possible if the Soviet Union, none of these occurred when the Soviet Union existed. None of them would be possible today if the Soviet Union existed, it seems to us. So for all these reasons, it became imperative to us to figure out what happened the best we could.
Right. And I'd say that, let me just talk a second about the fate of the book. It was first published in 2004, and the second edition was published in 2010. It's been translated into a number of languages: Russian, Bulgarian, Farsi, Greek, Turkish, Portuguese. It's had 2 printings. French. It's had 3 editions in Spanish: Cuba, Ecuador, Spain. It's been translated and published in Chinese, Italian, and a few months ago we got the news that from India that the Tamil language, which is a southern Indian language, wanted to translate and publish it. And so it's when we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together for promotion, and what basically has happened, we're proud to say, is that individuals who are politically active in these countries and in these languages, simply who knew English and whose English was good enough to read the original, just decided to translate it and publish it. So that's really how this happened. And it was really the arguments in the book were what persuaded them to take up the task of translation and publication.
In your book, you examine Nikita Khrushchev's reforms and their impact. I'm interested in your perspective on the power struggle between Khrushchev and Lavrentiy Beria. Did ideological differences play a role in their rivalry, despite both seeking to diverge from Stalin's approach?
In my view, the struggle between Beria and the rest of the leadership, including Khrushchev, had very little of an ideological component to it, very little differences in politics. Although I would say, you know, they weren't completely negligible, that after Stalin's death, Beria, for example, floated the idea of letting East Germany go, you know, letting East Germany unite with West Germany and giving up the hope of building socialism there. Khrushchev and the rest of the leaders thought this was ridiculous betrayal, and indeed, East Germany became a very successful socialist country. So there wasn't. Also, Beria reversed some of Stalin's repression. For example, he dismissed the idea of the so-called doctor's plot, etc. But these don't seem to be the root cause of the disagreement between Beria and the rest of the leadership. If I had to venture a guess just on my general readings with no particular insights, is that Beria was a very difficult, maybe even unsavory personality who was very two-faced in his attitude towards Stalin, very adulatory towards Stalin and sycophantic towards Stalin when Stalin had power. But as soon as Stalin died, even at his death, at his funeral, Beria couldn't conceal his disdain and contempt for Stalin. So he was very two-faced, and I think this kind of two-facedness and his power hungriness really got on the nerves of the other Politburo members, including Khrushchev, and that's why they finally plotted to get rid of him.
Beria was associated with the severe. By the time of Stalin's death, collectively the leadership wanted to get beyond the severe repression of the Stalin era, and Beria was associated with the severe repression of the Stalin era. Although he was not the worst, he moderated Yezhov's extreme repression when he took over his job as the head of security for the Soviet state. So for these reasons, there was kind of a collective decision that he wouldn't be removed from power.
Right. If you look at some of the recent works by Grover Furr, he says that Beria was responsible for lessening the arrests that had occurred under Yezhov, and even accused Yezhov of fabricating some of these accusations against other communists. So it's a contradictory figure, but anyway, I don't think there was any basic policy or ideological differences behind the split.
The book emphasizes how the second economy negatively affected the Soviet Union. Could you elaborate on that?
What we argue is that after 1953, after Stalin's the Stalin era came to an end, a new basis for bourgeois thinking began growing within socialism. This basis was the population engaged in private economic activity for personal gain in a so-called second economy that existed side by side with the first socialist economy. At first, the existence of this second economy was disguised by its interpenetration with the first economy, or the planned economy, the state economy. The second economy did not usually involve a separate class of people, but rather workers and farmers in the primary economy who spent time making money on the side in illegal or legal private economic activity. But increasingly, however, in the post-war years, the second economy embraced more and more people and accounted for more and more of their income, and in effect created a petty bourgeois stratum. Private economic activity never totally disappeared under socialism, but after being restrained under Stalin, it emerged with new vitality under Khrushchev, flourished under Brezhnev, and in many respects replaced the primary socialist economy under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And it had a profound and negative effect on Soviet socialism because it created or recreated private sources of income and systems of production. And this led to widespread corruption and criminality. The second economy spawned ideas and sentiments to justify private enterprise. It became a source of funds for critics and opponents of socialism. And finally, it provided a material basis for social democratic ideas. So for all these reasons, this phenomenon is central to our book and central to the argument that we make that how can you explain the emergence of a Gorbachev after 70 years of socialism? How could policies such as his develop without a material base for those policies? So that's our core position on the second economy.
Right. It's kind of related to this other argument we make, which is that the Soviet collapse was not due to any crisis in the socialist system. There was no manifest crisis in the socialist system in the Soviet Union in 1985. There was no mass unemployment. There were no strikes. There were no riots. There was no clamoring for a change in leadership. There was no crisis. I mean, pollsters in American pollsters in the Soviet Union in 1985 said Soviet citizens are just as happy with their system as the Americans are with their system, which is not to say that everybody was happy, but there was no mass discontent. But there were these underlying problems. And in fact, I was going to say that when Gorbachev took over in 1985, somebody asked him, a reporter asked him, how long could the Soviet Union last? He said, there's no crisis. Soviet Union could last 15 years, He didn't see any imminent crisis in the Soviet Union. Although, in fact, the speech he gave just before assuming the leadership said there will be no major changes. Then, of course, he completely reversed himself and started talking about the need for a revolution, etc. But there was no crisis, but there was these underlying problems of some of them created by the second economy, some of them in which the second economy was responding. Yes, the Soviet Union did have problems with the quantity and quality of some consumer goods. There's no question about that. There were problems with corruption, but none of these problems had created a crisis by 1985. It was Gorbachev who created the crisis.
Yuri Andropov was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1982 until his death in 1984. And you argue that he could have saved the Soviet Union. Could you expand on that?
I think that Yuri Andropov would have been a great leader. There's no great biography of Andropov. So, but what we do know about him was very impressive. He was a regional leader and very successful in Siberia, and that most of all, he was trained by some of the leading Bolsheviks of his time. He was mentored by Kuusinen, the head of the Communist Party of Finland. He was mentored worked for many years for Molotov, who was the second in command of Stalin, really. And he was tempered by real struggles. That is, he fought as a partisan, one of the leaders in Finland during World War II. And then he was second to Molotov during the Hungarian crisis. So when there was a Hungarian rebellion, what was it, 1956? And he was responsible for dealing with that crisis. And then he became head of the KGB during the time of the dissidents, Solzhenitsyn. He had to deal with this. So he was tempered by real struggle, and he showed a cool head and a firm grasp of Marxism-Leninism. And in contrast, you might say, to Gorbachev, who never had these kind of struggles, never had these kind of mentors, who was a competent leader in Stavropol. But as one commentator said, being a leader in Stavropol was like being mayor of Las Vegas. You know, I mean, it was a resort area. And he never had the kind of mentors or the kind of struggle that Andropov had. When Andropov became the leader, the last surviving Bolshevik was Molotov. He was 94 years old. And Molotov said that he was very impressed with Andropov. He'd worked with Andropov before. Andropov was a solid guy. Andropov wanted to make socialism better, and he understood the problems. And plus, he said Andropov had no temptations to move to the right, which, you know, unlike Gorbachev. So I don't think there's any better endorsement you could get of anybody than Molotov, the last surviving Bolshevik.
Andropov also, when he was head of the KGB, he did not fear to prosecute the higher-ups. He went after Leonid Brezhnev's son or daughter, I forget which, who had been involved in corruption, and it takes a certain caliber of person to have the courage to do that. So there were many features of Andropov that really, the one thing he did not have was time. He died at age 69 of kidney failure, and one of our favorite historians is the British Marxist historian
Hobsbawm?
Hobsbawm, who said that he was asked. He said if Andropov had lived another 15 years, he thought the Soviet Union would still be around.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting observation.
After Andropov died, he was succeeded by Konstantin Chernenko. Even though he died 13 months into his rule, I was curious what you make of his time as leader.
Again, I think, you know, my most reliable source, again, is Molotov. And Molotov knew Chernenko and was very underwhelmed by him and very underimpressed. He basically said Chernenko is a leader who has been foisted on our people because we can't find a better one at the moment, or something like that. That he's a time server until we can find a better leader. Chernenko, I think, did one thing that I remember, which was he changed the name of Volgograd back to Stalingrad, something like that. But otherwise, he did not seemed to understand and grasp and face the problems that were facing the Soviet Union, which Andropov did. For example, the problem of corruption. Chernenko never undertook corruption, and in fact, he may have been a symbol of how high the corruption went. When, after he died, they opened up Chernenko's safe and found it stuffed with rubles. How does a Soviet leader get a safe stuffed with rubles if he's not part of the corruption? So he was not a solution to the problems the Soviet Union faced. He was a symbol of them. And most importantly, I think he was a symbol of an old and tired leadership, that Brezhnev had been a solid leader, but he lasted too long. He'd suffered several strokes, a heart attack before he died. He was so enfeebled by the time he died, he could not even read his own speeches. And then there was Andropov, who was a great leader, but sick with kidney disease, and he died 15 months after taking leadership. So Chernenko kind of symbolized this decrepitude of the leadership and a need for a new vitality. And so in that sense, as a symbol, I think Chernenko is important in a way that he helps explain why Gorbachev, in spite of his rather weak vita, was able to assume leadership, and why the other leaders in the Politburo rallied behind him, because he was in many ways the opposite of Chernenko. I mean, he was young. I mean, you have to give him that. I mean, he was young, he was dynamic, he was well-spoken, he was educated, he was energetic. One of the first things he did on taking office was go out and visit factories and meet people in the streets and markets, etc. And people were very communists, were very enthusiastic about this, and very happy to have a dynamic leadership in place, such a contrast with a guy like Chernenko.
You argue in your book that it was not the disease itself that led to the Soviet Union's collapse, but rather Gorbachev's medicine. Looking back, do you think Gorbachev was an especially poor choice for leader in 1985? Would any of Chernenko's other possible successors have made similar decisions, or was Gorbachev's approach uniquely damaging?
I would say Yegor Ligachev would have been a better choice. Although in 1983-84, Ligachev was already supporting Gorbachev's bid for leadership, but there were others in the Politburo who would have been better choices. There was a group around. The appointees of Brezhnev were Aliyev, Grishin, Sherbitsky, Tikhonov, who favored a GDR economic model. There was a Ryzhkov group which favored reform through intensification of production and greater efficiency. There was a group around Lev Zykov who favored promoting machine building and more emphasis on scientific and technical progress. And any of these would have been, of course, it would have been impossible to know in advance, because when Gorbachev came into power in April 1985, he followed for almost 2 years Andropov's policies. So, but the other forces came to bear on him, and he moved in a rightward direction. But there were others in the leadership who could have managed the reform process better than Gorbachev did.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I think Gorbachev, turned out to be a terrible leader, a disaster. It couldn't have been worse. But so how do you explain this? So I think there are three possible explanations out there. One you might say is a left-wing explanation for why Gorbachev went bad or why Gorbachev was such a terrible leader. And the left-wing explanation would be he was always bad. He was always a revisionist. Even some people argue he was a CIA agent. Well, as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party says, it's good with any explanation to start with the facts. And the facts don't really support that. There are no facts that indicate that Gorbachev was a terrible or revisionist, opportunist, or a CIA agent, as bad as he turned out to be. The second explanation, you might say, is a right-wing explanation, which is that Gorbachev tried to make reforms, and he ran into such opposition among the old guard in the party that he had no choice but to undermine the old guard, undermine the party, open up, et cetera, et cetera. And again, there are no real facts that support this. Gorbachev did not face opposition at the beginning. On the other hand, everybody was enthusiastic about him. Andropov, Yeltsin, Molotov. There was no basic opposition to Gorbachev at the beginning. But so then there's our explanation, which is that, which is supported by some of the facts, as the head of an appointee by Gorbachev said, what's his name?
Yakovlev?
No, no, the spokesman for the deputies, Congress of Deputies, Zucharsky was his, I believe, who was friends with Gorbachev all the way from college, and he said Gorbachev was a solid communist. You know, he wanted to make socialism better, and you know, he wept when Stalin died, et cetera, et cetera. But he said also the trouble with Gorbachev is he was a country bumpkin. You know, he was he'd never traveled with the Soviet Union even, you know, and he had never been in any serious struggles, and he was not well versed in Marxism Leninism. He was a bright and very loquacious and very charming, but he was not a solid communist. And consequently, what happened is, according to those around him, he fell under the sway of a guy like Yakovlev, who was a pretty committed right-wing opportunist and started feeding Gorbachev all of these ideas about weakening the party and opening up the party and criticizing the party, etc. And this is where the trouble began. But it wasn't opposition that drove Gorbachev to the right. It was his own weaknesses, as well as, you know, the as we say, the growth of the second economy and what it represented. I mean, the second economy produces this kind of petty bourgeois who have petty bourgeois values and petty bourgeois aspirations. They want to make money, and they're not interested in international solidarity. They're not interested in advancing the cause of the working class. They want to make money. And these elements became very strong in the latter days of the Soviet Union, and Yakovlev was really their spokesperson.
Although the majority of the Politburo opposed Gorbachev's political reforms, why wasn't he ousted from leadership as Khrushchev had been in 1964?
By April 1991, economic conditions had deteriorated so much that the leaders who would later comprise the so-called the August coup leaders, who really should be identified by as the State Committee for the State of Emergency, they were trying to remove him in Central Committee votes, and they were trying to outwit him in Parliament. So there were efforts, in fact, increasing efforts as time wore on to remove him. But after 1988, when Ligachev was removed from the Politburo, Gorbachev and Yakovlev pretty much had a free hand to move rightward, and so the opponents of Gorbachev in the leadership just were not successful in blocking him. But it indicates the degree to which the party had declined, in that it was able to deal with the unsuccessful and wrong-headed policies of Khrushchev back in 1964, but it was not able to confront and change the policies of Gorbachev in the late 1980s.
I agree with that. Gorbachev came in 85 and he, again, immediately began putting his own people in power on the Politburo, head of the Russian party, et cetera, head of the KGB, et cetera. And so by 87 or 88, the last leader standing, I think, who could have, again, as Joe says, who could have represented real change from where Gorbachev was going, was Ligachev. And Gorbachev set a trap for him and did him in and drove him out of power. And so after 88, I don't see any real forces that were able to mount a campaign against Gorbachev.
When do you think was the last point when the collapse of the Soviet Union could have been prevented?
Well, I think a lot of us, some of us, me in any way, thought, well, maybe this attempted coup in August 1991, maybe that could have rescued things. That's what I thought in 1991, that maybe there were some real, Marxist-Leninists there who saw the danger and were going to get rid of Gorbachev and put things back on Andropov's path. But I think I was pretty naive then too, because really, if you look at that gang of 8, so-called, who kind of engineered the so-called coup in 1991, they were all Gorbachev people. And they really didn't do what would have they had no plan to really replace Gorbachev, and they had really no alternative ideas. I think the last one, as Joe said, with any alternative to Gorbachev, was Ligachev. So I think that that so-called coup or attempted coup in August would not, if you look at it closely, there's not any indication that it would have made any material difference, except possibly it would have postponed the disintegration of the Soviet Union, because that was seemed to be the issue that motivated people, that new treaty that was, dissolving the Soviet Union into its component parts. That might have been stopped or postponed for a while. But the overall destruction of a weakening of the Communist Party, the weakening of centralized planning, the opening up to private enterprise, there's no indication that these guys would have, this gang of 8 would have opposed that.
Yes, a coup is the unlawful, forcible overthrow of a constitutionally legitimate government. That's the definition of a coup. But the State Committee for the State of Emergency did not try to overthrow the Soviet government. It was the Soviet government. And so the Western media and a lot of Western accounts of the events of August 1991 try to portray it as a coup, but it really was not. It's now established after 10 years of research that the leaders thought that Gorbachev was on their side, and when he pulled the rug out from under them, they panicked because they had no plan for stabilization of the economy and the political system, which would have entailed reasserting control of the media, probably arresting Yeltsin and his key allies, launching an emergency economic program, which would end the hardships of workers and consumers, and producing a union treaty that preserved, or at least mostly preserved, the Soviet Union, as the March '91 referendum required the government to do. So in the end, the real coup maker was Yeltsin, because the political advantage, the failure of this state of emergency was so ignominious that it enabled him to seize full power in Russia, to eliminate the CPSU, and to do away with the USSR. So it benefited Yeltsin primarily.
Interesting. Your theory regarding Gorbachev's possible involvement in the 1991 Soviet coup attempt really caught my attention. So could you elaborate on it?
It's not really our theory. This is a murky historical episode. It was very murky back in the early 90s, but it's gotten somewhat clearer. But many leading Soviet experts share this view that Gorbachev himself was involved. The leading authority on the August '91 events is John Dunlop. Other ones are Anthony D'Agostino, William Odom, Amy Knight of Johns Hopkins University. They all take this view that he was involved, and that he let the coup leaders, he let the people who were trying to declare a state of emergency, he led them to think he was on their side. And then according to Amy Knight, she says that Gorbachev reasoned that if the State Committee for the State of Emergency succeeded in gaining control and stopping the disintegration of the Soviet Union, he, Gorbachev, who was feigning sickness in a Black Sea resort, could feign getting well and take charge. And if it did not succeed, he could come to Moscow and arrest everybody. So that was the kind of thinking that was going on. So it's not really our theory. It is now the consensus of experts on Soviet politics that he was. He spent months after August writing a short book about so-called August coup, and at this point he was almost disoriented. Things were going so bad. The economy was in a tailspin. He was making one concession after another to Yeltsin, and he seemed to be more concerned about the opinion of him, his reputation in the West, than he was concerned about his immediate political circumstances. But Yeltsin was the winner of this catastrophe. The Western media helped him by portraying him as the defender of Soviet democracy. There he was on a truck with a bullhorn outside the White House, denouncing Gorbachev, and he was being propped up by the Western media. And so it was in every way a catastrophe.
And to conclude, what lessons should other socialist states learn from the collapse of the Soviet Union?
I don't think any communists in the world have been more concerned about what happened in the Soviet Union than the Chinese. For them, it's an existential question. I mean, what went wrong? Why did the Soviet Union collapse? And what mistakes did they make so that we don't make these same mistakes and end up with the same fate? So they've undertaken a serious examination of this problem. and including, by the way, translating our book, which is available in China. But what General Secretary Xi says is he said a number of things on this, kind of encapsulating the Chinese view, is that there are at least three lessons that the Chinese should draw from the Soviet collapse. One is of the importance of ideology. That is, you cannot, as the Soviets did, throw out their history, throw out Lenin, throw out Stalin, and hope to survive as a socialist country. You have to have a stronger ideology as not simply throw out Stalin and not throw out Lenin, but as Xi said, Stalin wasn't perfect. He was maybe 80% right, but you don't throw him out, somebody who's still 80% right, even though they may be 20% wrong. Yeah. So that's one lesson, the importance of ideology. The Chinese Communist Party, which has millions of members, has thousands of schools that teach Marxism and Leninism. They take the ideological struggle and ideological education very seriously. A second lesson, I think, is the importance of the keeping a strong party. Lenin said in State and Revolution, basically, there are two defining elements of socialism. One is collectivize the property, and secondly, build a dictatorship of the proletariat, a strong communist party. And I think that there's evidence that the Chinese communists have learned this lesson also, that even though they have allowed private property to flourish, a kind of new economic policy, if you will, and have allowed the private sector to control as much as 70% of the economy, which is a pretty dangerous situation given the experience of the Soviet Union. How even when the black market controlled maybe 20% of the economy in the Soviet Union, it still produced this petty bourgeois ideology and petty bourgeois class. So the Chinese are in a much more difficult situation with now 70% of the production in private hands, even though the commanding heights, as Lenin said, remained in the control of the Chinese Communist Party. But the difference between the Soviet situation and the Chinese situation is that the Chinese have learned the importance of keeping a strong Communist Party. And so, whereas Gorbachev weakened the Communist Party and undermined socialist planning, the Chinese have not done this, and the Chinese capitalists have to follow the state plan, and there are numerous examples of Chinese billionaires who do exist towing the line with the Communist Party directives. And the third, I think, lesson that the Chinese have learned, the Chinese communists, is the importance of combating corruption. Because when you have a strong private economy, whether it's legal or illegal, it breeds corruption. And that's been one of the initiatives, if you follow the Chinese situation and follow Xi's leadership, has been this prosecution of corruption. Most recently, a number of generals were arrested and dismissed for corruption. But this has also happened with some of the leading billionaires in China. So I think these are some of the main lessons: the importance of ideology, the danger of having a second or private economy, and third, the importance of combating corruption. If you read the Chinese literature, there are other lessons they draw as well, but it seems to me that these are three important lessons.
Thank you both. Where would you recommend readers to get your book?
Well, it can be, if you go to Amazon.com, where a lot of people buy books, you can find it for $17. The publisher, iUniverse, also you can also buy it from iUniverse as a new. So that would be as a new paperback. An electronic version can be bought for $10, Kindle, and I'm sure there are other websites where you can buy used books, and so we encourage people, if we said anything that interests you, to buy a copy.
And check out the website as well, mltoday.com, where we continue to write and publish writers who have similar points of view.
Right.
Thank you, Roger and Joe, very much for joining us today, and I wish you continued success in your work.
Okay.
Thank you very much for having us.